Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Guru Podcast featuring insights from artists and professionals of color. Today's podcast features Amazon best-selling author Antoine Bandele. Since 2017, Antoine has written fantasy and sci-fi stories for and about the African motherland and the diaspora. Not only is he a fierce independent publisher, but he also owns AB Services, an audiobook services company. So stay tuned for another informative episode of the Urban Guru Podcast. Today on the podcast, I'm happy to welcome Antoine Bandele. Hope I got that right.
Antoine Bandele. It's funny because I have a lot of different pronunciations because like Antoine could be Antoine, like the French do it, and then like Bandele, it's weird.
Oh, wow. So you have it's a perfect name, particularly for an author and a creator. But Antoine, he's Amazon best-selling author in action, adventure, fantasy, dark fantasy, sword and sorcery, African-American fantasy, and African literature. And since, 2017, you've published books that are geared towards young adults, the African diaspora, and things like that. And so I just really want to welcome you to the podcast today.
Thank you. Yeah, and that was all things that I have done. Yes, those are all correct.
Yeah, and he's very, very modest because he's also he's a video editor. He's a sound engineer. Are you an actor?
No, that's funny though. You mentioned that though. That's what I initially was doing in middle school up until half of high school. I was in the performing arts and all that. But then I started. Oh, it was a mistake. So during my guidance counselor time, he did not put me in a PE class, and I wanted to get my PE requirement out of the way in my second year of high school because in California you're only required to do 2 years of physical education, which is really bad. But as a kid you're like, oh yeah, I don't have to do physical education. So he didn't give me that session, and he put me into a film class, and then from there I was like, oh, I actually like behind the scenes a whole lot more. So then I started doing a lot of that. A lot of the tech stuff for performing arts, like the behind the scenes, behind the stage kind of stuff. And then I started doing video editing and all that, which turned into me becoming a YouTuber when I left high school. And applying that now to my audiobook engineering and publishing.
Yes. And we are going to talk about all of that because like I said, you're a multifaceted individual. And just a quick thing. One of your series, the TJ Young series, is been optioned for adaptation, and
it is currently optioned. It is being written. I don't know if it's being written right now, but I know in a few weeks, the writer that is attached is going to be announced. It's going to be a big blast out. I'm not sure when this is going to come out. We're recording this in early October, so by the time this comes out, it probably would have already been announced, and this person who is writing it will be announced as well.
So and I definitely want to talk more about that so you can explain to everybody, because you do have that, you at least have that much on your website that has been optioned. So I'm assuming it's the whole series has been optioned.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. There's a deal where the first book, if it does well, kind of a thing, you get more and more. But yeah, the whole series essentially has been optioned. But really, it's the first book in particular that's like the focus. Obviously, I mean that's how Hollywood does it. They're like, all right, let's see how the first book or how the first adaptation goes, and then go from there. But yes, there is an option for the first book and subsequent books to be done as a series.
Fantastic. And like I said, we are going to talk about that because I think that's absolutely awesome that's happening. But I have a quick question for you. Put you on the spot. How many titles do you have published in all? Out of all the short stories, novellas, comics, novels that you have, how many do you have total out there?
Total. Okay, let me hop on over to Amazon very quickly. And then I'll just list it off. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 right now.
And your writing career, at least from what you say, or since 2017, you've been publishing material. Obviously, you've probably written since you were from a young age. You probably always like to tell stories.
Yeah, that was something my mom was very good about for me and my brother. She always encouraged our creativity because she herself was a very creative person as well.
Well, tell us a little bit about that. I mean, what's your first experience that you remember with writing or drawing, whatever you want to talk about?
Yeah, that actually was the initial thing, was me drawing, and I thought, oh, I can be like a comic book artist or some sort of artist. I
Mm-hmm.
even had submitted like one of those. Remember back in the 90s, they used to have these commercials for like, hey, your child might be a creative genius. Send these sample pieces to our school and we'll see if we'll give them a scholarship. So I did like that sort of a thing. I've been in programs like, all my life. Film programs.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in anything creative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the first time I felt, legit at it is when my mom, I think I read in a story. It was like a children's book. It was like, artwork
Mm-hmm.
and my writing. And we went to like Office Depot and she got it laminated. And then like just seeing my like work laminated, and I don't even know if I even still have this. She probably still has it in her box somewhere. Was just like very encouraging, to see that. Or even back in the day, it was awesome just seeing your stuff typed out. Like now it's easy to do, right? You can, type a document and then print it out very easily. But back in the day, you had to like, go to
Mm-hmm.
these Office Maxes or Office Depot or Circuit City, which is now dead. And get that stuff laminated and printed. And it was just really, fun. And you felt like a real professional writer back in the day doing that sort of thing.
Let me ask you a quick question because something just came to mind when you said that. Do you ever print out a final draft or a first draft of one of your manuscripts just to print it out and physically see it?
I used to, but then they got expensive.
Yeah.
So then I was like,
Yeah.
I'll just do it digitally. But yeah, for my first, I would say like maybe first 3 books, I
Uh-huh.
used to print them out and do my
Yeah.
corrections and stuff like that in my read
Mm-hmm.
through that way. Now
Yeah.
another way you can do it is just by going to Amazon's KDP print. KDP standing for Kindle Direct Publishing, which is what a lot of independent publishers
Mm-hmm.
use. And you can just get a book that way too. Like that's a really good way. Like all my proofreaders, they actually proof on a printed book in the way that it will look like when it's
Mm-hmm.
going to be published and when it's out to the public.
Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting question. And again, we're gonna get to some more in-depth questions, but you just mentioned indie as opposed to traditional. What are you? Are you both? Are you one or the other?
I am indie and I'm aggressively indie. I mean, case in point, like this thing that's going on with the movie option,
Mm-hmm.
100% of that going to me, not going through a middleman of a traditional publisher or, some sort of subsidiary of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I felt like I developed that because of my time with YouTube and being a YouTuber and being my own entrepreneur and making my own successes
Mm-hmm.
versus going the traditional route of, even with YouTube, there's sometimes YouTubers who will go with what is called a multi-channel network, which is like kind of like a publisher, but in the YouTube world. And I never want to do that either. I just want to do everything myself. And with the idea that, profits on the back end, yes, might take me more time to
Mm-hmm.
market or maybe take me more time to produce the content. But the reward at the end of it is much greater.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, in addition to just the quality of the writing, is just I loved your covers. Your
Yeah, I'm
covers
I'm
are
huge on that.
so they're so engrossing. It's not just the character; it's like it's drawing you into the world that you're talking about, and so that's really fantastic.
And
So,
yeah, even a point on that about being indie, because I know sometimes people use the word self-published, and I don't use that word often because I'm not self-published. I am definitely indie published. And the key difference between that is that, like you mentioned, my covers, right? I don't do any of my own covers. I go out and hire professionals to do that in the same way that I don't edit my own books. I hire professionals to edit my books. When I do all my audiobooks, I don't do it myself. I go out and I get actors to do that. So I'm still very much doing the same thing a traditional publisher would be doing. I'm hiring these same people who work for these traditional publishers. I just give them, their pay directly. And again, like I said before, yeah, that's a little bit harder on the front end because you have to, make that investment. But again, the back end, very, very important.
I can attest to everything he's saying, folks, because I have worked with him on my first audiobook and I'm going to do my second one with him. And he is absolutely right. He hires top-notch narrators, voiceover actors, really. And so what you're doing, and I think it's interesting that we apply indie to it. And like you said, sometimes people misconstrue that with self-publishing, but you're doing everything that a regular publisher does. Like you said, the covers, the editors, the proofreaders, the content editors, well, all that stuff. By every right, you are a publisher. Maybe we should use a different term instead of independent, maybe just a small publisher or something.
Yeah, or
Or a
something, a
publisher.
small press or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Because when you go back, I was just reading something where they were talking about these guys that set up like the League of Nine or something like that, the
Hmm.
Boston Tea Party, that's what it was, and a group of men who set it up. And they, most of them they were called publishers, but when you look at what they were publishing, they were small publishers. Today we would try to call them indie, but back then they were legit publishers, even if it was just publishing something that was just went out in their local community. They were called publishers. And so I really think that you really I'm glad you made that distinction between self and indie and maybe small, or just one day we'll just call them publishers,
Or
because
just publishers. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, nice, nice. Just going back just a little bit. So you were really inspired by your parents. They really supported your creative endeavors and things like that. And so you started out with the drawing. So what really got you going with the writing aspect of it? I know you still do all those things. And I love how with some of your series, it can be a novella, it can be a short story, it can be a comic, you know,
Right.
all these. And maybe did that lead you into majoring in multimedia?
Yeah, in university at that time, that was like a big thing was to be a jack of all trades. Like
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
before, when you go to like those sort of schools, it's like, oh, you're going to be a director, you're going to be a cinematographer, are you going to be a writer? Like, like it was like, what is your lane, And then when I was going to school around
mm-hmm,
2008, 2012 time period, multimedia, if I'm not mistaken, at Cal State Northridge, which is where I attended, was a newer or a new-ish major that was within the media sub school. I don't know how you would say it, because the major, I would say.
mm-hmm.
um they were advising kids, like my counselor for college. She was like, hey, what do you want to do? Ask me these questions. She's like, it sounds like there's a lot there. Why not go the multimedia route, which is where you learn everything? So you get a little bit of the writing, you get a little bit of the Photoshop, a little bit of the Avid or Premiere or Final Cut Pro, that kind of stuff. So that when you're out in the world, and you'll see that a lot too, even in professional settings,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in the film industry, they want people who do multiple things. Like they're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, are you an editor? Oh, cool. Can you also do visual effects? It's not just one skill set anymore. It's like, hey, can you do multiple things? And that makes you more valuable within those spaces.
Yeah, that's really interesting to know, because I came through college just a little bit earlier than that. um, but when I went out into the work world, I would often land jobs that were multimedia jobs, like multimedia specialists and stuff like that. And you're exactly right. You did everything from producing, directing stuff, uh,
Right.
certainly scripting, visual effects, editing, all that. You basically did everything. And so my first work experience was doing something like that. You did everything. So it's really cool to see that at one time they actually decided you could actually pursue a degree like that, because it really did make more sense in the way the world was changing with the advent of the technology, and companies using technology to do all these types of things at a more affordable price too, because you didn't have to pay huge sums to be able to do things. So it's interesting. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
especially during that time too, because the turn of the 2010s
Mm-hmm.
was a lot of new media. You had like Netflix, coming up. You had YouTube really popping off, Twitch for streaming. So all that stuff was very timely. I would say, for all the stuff that I learned at that time.
What do you think about the term transmedia? And I think you know what I mean when I say transmedia, because some people are now confusing it. But what I've taken away is transmedia is it's still multimedia. It's kind of like what you're doing. You're having your stories in different media. You might have a comic book, you might have a book. Now you might have an audio book. You might even do a video on YouTube. So you have it in all these different types of media, but it's all connected to the same title.
The strongest thing that I think authors need to recognize
Mm-hmm.
is that when they create IP, when they're creating a book,
Mm-hmm.
it can be way more than just that book, you know, like even thinking about audio, like audio is really its own thing too. Like it has its own separate audience, separate thing that it is, but you also can, you know, have that be adapted. You also can do a comic book. There's an author friend I have who created a Dungeons and Dragon campaign guide based on his sci-fi novel, which you totally can, because you do a bunch of world building when you're writing your story. So hey, remap that to a campaign guide, and there's people out there who love playing, you know, these Dungeons and Dragons games. You apply it. Like there's so much you can do with just the single story that you might produce.
So let's just go with that for a second. So one of the things that I want to do with the podcast is to help those people that are out there, those indie creators, particularly writers, is maybe give them some helpful tips and things like that to help them over the hump of finishing their things, their stories, their ideas, but also getting them out there. Would you, it sounds like you would suggest this, but are you suggesting that somebody from the very start consider all the different options that you have for your story, for your IP?
Yeah, you always want to see your option. I mean, obviously you want to focus first on whatever the thing you're making, creating. If you're a comic book person, you know, think about the comic book first and foremost. If you're doing a novel, think about that first and foremost. But then after that point, definitely look out to, like, you know, other facets. And even if you might not be interested in some of those things, that's when you can then hire out those services. So for example, if let's say you wrote a novel, but you want to adapt it to a comic book, but you yourself aren't really into comic books, you can, there are so many production companies out there that can help you with that. There's places that adapt, you know, your novel to a comic book, and then they actually will do the whole process of scripting and like the thumbnails and then the final rendering and then the line work and the colors. So anything that you think you can do out of your single story, you can do, and it doesn't have to just be you. Again, not being a self-published person, but being indie or being a small press.
And I think that's I like that point, because I'm coming to that in some regards to some of my IP. When I first started in film and video. And I actually started with writing screenplays, but I wanted to step back because I was writing sci-fi screenplays. I wanted to step back and I wanted to have a little more freedom to develop the world and do the world building. But now I'm to the point where I want to come back to the adaptations. One of the things that you just said is something that finally occurred to me. Yes, I know how to write a screenplay. Do I necessarily have to write it? You know, can I get somebody else to do it? You know, and save myself the headache. You know, and that's one of the places where I'm coming to, and I appreciate that point. You don't have to, even if you have a facility or you understand it. Maybe your understanding it can help you if you go hire somebody because now you know how to talk to them.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very much the case.
Question for you, and it's probably one. It's a simple one, but I get it all the time, and I'm sure you do. Where do your ideas come from? And I know creative people hate that. You know?
I mean, they come from everywhere, you know, like just playing it, and it could be like the most simplest thing. Like I could like play a video game, and I'm like on a virtual date with like two characters, right, in the whatever the video game might be, and that little thing will spark off, oh, I had trouble with this scene in this, you know, work I'm using, let me apply that. Or, you know, you're watching a movie or something, and that's the thing too, I think, with creators, making sure that you are an active participant in the media you consume. Like definitely being a creative or a writer or director, whatever it might be, you kind of ruin the cinematic experience or like the novel experience sometimes, because you have to always be applying that. Like it's hard to turn off and just be like, I just got to be a fan and not think about anything, right? But you kind of have, if you want to be a professional, if you want to do this, you know, at a high level, you definitely have to be an active participant in what you're viewing. So anytime I'm at him, I know my partner gets really mad at me whenever I'm in the theater and I like pull out my phone because I'm watching a movie in the theater. I'm like, oh, that's a great idea, and like, you know, pull it out on my phone and like write it in my notes sometimes, because like, you know, I have to be an active thinker of that, and that's how, you know, you develop these ideas and make sure that they feel very well rounded when you are, you know, sitting down and actually crafting the story.
I'm the same way. I have done that when I've gone to the movies with people, and it's like you have to you have to turn it off to a certain degree, but I'm still that way. And it was so bad with me one time. I recently went to see a movie, and then something happened up on the screen, and I immediately reached for the control to pause it.
You're like, oh wait, wait, hold on.
It's like oops. It's like, oh, okay, let me remember that. Normally I'll try to wait until I get out of a movie, but I do the same thing. And you're right. Ideas, or in what you were saying, maybe you have an issue with something that you are working on, and you take your mind off of it and you go and watch something else, and then you might see something and it's like, oh wow. That happens to me all the time too. It really does. I think it's part of the creative process. When something occurs to you, an idea occurs to you, what's your first step that you take?
Idea? Oh, well, I put it in my notes. So I'm actually dealing with that right now because right now it's Preptober, which is a
Mm,
funny little saying for NaNoWriMo, which is the National Writers Month in
mm-hmm.
November. So right now I'm dealing with that because anytime I have an idea, I put it in my notes. No, I often don't edit it. I just, place it in. And I'm like, all right, and worry about that later. So now I'm at the later point where I'm about to get into book 3 of my young adult series. And now it's time for me to figure out and make sense of these notes that I just put down randomly throughout the last 18 months. So from there, that's where I, look at all the hodgepodge ideas I have and then try to make sense of them. How can they be more cohesive as a narrative? Where are the arcs that I can find? And that's where I get into like the outlining phase. And then of course you get into the drafting phase, and then beta readers, line editors, all that stuff.
And oh man, see, I'm telling you, every time you answer a question, there's like 5 more questions pop up off of the things you say. First of all, real quick, what series are you talking about? Your third book?
TJ Young and the Orishas. That's the one that's optioned currently for screenplay adaptation. I'm about to get into book 3. Like I'm right now, like October, I'm supposed to be doing it right now. And organizing right now. I'm trying to organize my ideas into a cohesive-ish outline.
Nice. Very nice. Very nice. So I always like to talk about the digital writer. And so you mentioned notes, taking notes. Are you grabbing an old-fashioned spiral notebook, a composition notebook, or are you using some kind of digital method to keep your notes?
Primarily digital. I'll say 90% digital, 10% is in a notebook. I do have like 3 manila, what do you call what do you call Moleskine, those notebooks. I have that at my desk. Wow. So sometimes I'll jot something down there. But yeah, 90% of the time it's going to be on a phone and then transfer to a Google Doc or something like that.
Okay, so on your phone, you just use just a note app, and then you just transfer it to Google Docs. You prefer Google Docs. And the only reason
Google Docs I prefer for sure because of the collaboration part of it. Because I can just send that out to beta readers, and they can give me notes directly, in the Google Doc, and it's just easier. It's easier for me to work in Google Docs.
Okay, nice. All right, because like I said, I always talk, and sometimes I'll do like a presentation or something at a convention talking about digital tools. So I'm always, and I've actually done a little short video where I've actually interviewed writers and stuff just to see what they use in their daily creation process. I ask them what apps and things that they use. So it's always interesting to get people's workflows and find out how they do things. So I guess from what you're saying that although it's kind of surprising, I would have thought it would have been the other way. You're more of you're not by the seat of your pants type of a writer.
No, I'm very, although I'm trying to, it's funny you say that because I am trying to change that for book 3 of TJ. Is because sometimes when you are an architect, which is what I am usually, thoroughly outline my stories. Naturally your characters want to do other things, and you're like, no, but this is the outline that I spent, a month on. And then, so I wanted to like take away that disappointment a little bit by, I'm still going to outline, but I'm just not going to be as detailed with my outlines to let it, so that if I do change something, I'm not so like, oh no, like what am I going to do? Kind of, so now I'm doing a scaled back outline so that I can be more freeform with the way I write the story.
No, I love that because I'm the same way. And when I would teach a writing class, I used to teach a screenwriting class, and I would, every time I mentioned something about doing any type of outlining, people would freak out and probably think that I was talking about what you probably initially did, where it's super detailed. It's like, no. for me, even with my books, it's just for each chapter, it's like 2 or 3 lines. I need this to happen. These characters are there, and I just kind of leave it at that. So I have a general idea
Yeah,
of
and I think that's what I want to do now too.
yeah,
And also it's more freeing. Because I feel like some of my best scenes
definitely.
are the
Mhm.
ones that you're like, oh, I just went left when I was supposed to go right. And those are like the most exciting because well, you
Yeah.
yourself, the writer, are engaged because you're like, well, I'm not actually sure how this scene's going to end. Versus if you are
Thank
a plotter,
you.
you're like,
Thank
oh, I know
you.
exactly how this is gonna end. So you kind of lose that drive of the want.
Well, I have to ask you this question because I remember a friend of mine, one of the most popular writing books is Stephen King's On Writing, and it's not even about the mechanics of writing. It's more
No,
about
not
the
really.
philosophy of it.
Yeah.
And it was after reading that I finally sat down and started writing my first words. And I'm gonna ask you about NaNoWriMo. Don't let me forget that.
Mhm.
Um, but the thing about it, and this is what I tell people, is like, because when I talk to other writers and stuff, if I start on a novel or a short story or a novella, I'm good at going all the way to the end and finishing that draft. And the reason that I do that is because of what you just said. It's the same thing that Stephen King said about maintaining your momentum. But I like what you said because that's what I tell new writers and things like that. Don't step away from your novel because not only do you lose some momentum, but your first time writing that novel is what you just said. Your characters, once they take on a life of their own, they will do unexpected things and you won't know what's going to happen. This will be your first real time to experience that story. Every time after that, you're rewriting. And I think that's a really
That's the
important
absolute
thing.
truth.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important thing that to some writers might miss, particularly less experienced writers or new writers that are coming to it. I feel so I don't know I don't know what to tell them when they back away from the story because I know how hard it is to get back into it. And so
It's
I
like
really
running, like when you're on the mile run, and then
uh,
if you slow up or stop, it's really hard to get the run going again.
yeah, you stop and take a break, sit down, you know. Yeah, it's like, and it really is. But and that was my experience, and I think that's why for me, I'm kind of like that. I'm more of a like you said, a general organizer. But when I wrote my first book, I had that general outline, and I knew they were going to meet the villain at the end. But when they finally met it, and who was experiencing the pain and stuff like that, that was the first time I experienced it. And I was experiencing all the emotions because I really didn't know what these characters were going to say and what they were going to do. In general, I
Mm,
did, but not as specific. And when I ended that, it was like, wow, I just walked away from all these people that I've known for the last 30 days. you know?
yeah, no, that's true.
And so now, are you going to do NaNoWriMo? Because you did mention
Yeah,
that.
yeah. This is my first time actually doing it. I've been aware of it like since I started writing, but I never had a project overlap with it. Because I'll already be like midway in a draft or something.
Yeah.
But this is the
Yeah.
first time I'm actually going to be starting in November for the first time. So I was like, oh, let me do it.
I did it, and ironically, the first 2 books I did 3 years in a row, and the first 2 books I did, first of all, I took a book that I actually or a screenplay. I took a outline for a screenplay and adapted it into a book, so that every day I sat down, I knew supposedly what I was supposed to write. Those 2 books, ironically, are in a series I haven't even released yet.
Oh my god, that's how it goes sometimes with that.
But yeah, but no, I really like that. You'll enjoy it, and you won't. I'm sure you won't have a problem with it. I always encourage, particularly newer writers, to do it. The ones that aren't sure if they can like crank out at least a novel length piece of work, try it. There's all kinds of supports that they have now. When they first started, they didn't have near as much stuff as they have now.
Right.
So yeah, you have an audiobook service. Tell us a little bit about that and how you got started with doing your audiobook service.
So I started it because, well, initially when I was doing my first novels, I just naturally was like, well, hey, I'm in multimedia, I'm a YouTuber, I'm in this space already.
Mhm.
Let me just do the audiobooks. And also, I should say too that I used to work at Apple Retail, in Los Angeles. And if you work anywhere like a retail or like a restaurant, um, like Los Angeles, New York, or any like the big cities, you're always going to be interacting with a lot of actors. So well, after leaving there, and I knew a bunch of people, I was like, hey, just come on in and like help me record my audio. And then eventually I had a co-authorship with another author who did fantasy as well. And naturally I did my audiobook like I always do. And so I said, or no, he said, who did, or he asked me, who did your audio? And I was like, oh, that was me. I just got one of my actor friends that I know from a place I used to work, and I did it. He's like, oh man, you should probably be doing this as a service. And then I actually like took him up. At first I was like, I don't think anyone's gonna like actually want me to pay me for what I do, but then I was very wrong about that. And now I'm here doing it full time with audiobook engineering and publishing.
And when did you start it up? I'm sorry.
Oh, in 2018 is when I think I started doing it for other people. Um,
So you did it for yourself. So you did your own audio?
yeah,
Or
just in my
no?
own stuff. Yeah, that's the one thing I'm actually self-published on is audio in the terms of the editing process, not the narration itself. But yeah, that's like the one thing in this entire process that I can say is actually self-published. Will be my audiobooks.
Mhm. And the editing process of it.
The editing, yeah, not the narration, because narration I get a
Mhm.
narrator to come in and do
Mhm.
that.
Mhm. Mhm. And again, folks, I recently just completed mine and I absolutely love it. And I'm coming back to do the next one. But it was a really good experience. And so, yeah, I remember the bad old days of if you drove down like Interstate 95 up and down Interstate 95, you could stop at a convenience store or gas station and you could rent an audio tape or a CD that you could play in your car and you
And yeah,
listen
switch them
to it.
out.
Yeah, and then you
CD1
switch
is
it
over. Please insert CD2.
back out. And then you go drive 300 miles and you turn them back in. I've always loved audiobooks. I've always one thing for me is I came up to DC to go to graduate film school, so I always hop in my car every weekend and drive all the way back home to Georgia. So it was a long haul for me, and XM radio wasn't available then, so I got tired of listening to my music on my CD. So I've always loved audiobooks. I've always loved the potential of them. I particularly loved them when they mixed in any sound effects and music. I think some of the ones that really blew me away before other people started doing it was the Star Wars.
Yep, that me too. That was my
Oh
first
gosh.
like even being aware of
Mm-hmm.
audiobooks. Not even with Harry Potter, because I know with Harry Potter I read through them as a child,
Mm-hmm.
but it was Star Wars books. I think it
Yes.
was one of my buddies. I think it was the Darth Bane trilogy in particular.
Ooh.
And he's like,
Ooh.
"Hey, like there's an audiobook and it has like the lightsaber sounds and the
Yes.
blasters and the starfighters." I was like, "Oh my god, I have to." And then yeah, it's like listening to a movie. And I
It
thought all
is.
audiobooks were like that. And then I
No.
realized I was so wrong. I was like, "Oh wait, no, that's not the standard for audiobooks."
No, it's not. No, it's not. But I always had people's like, well, I read a book. It's like, yeah, I read a book too, but I can also listen to a book. And when you're stuck in traffic or when you're commuting traffic, it's nice sometimes.
Yeah, or
So
taking a jog or whatever.
just talk a little bit about the audio, how important you think audiobooks are.
Oh, it's almost to the point where I actually prioritize
Mm-hmm.
my audio above all else. There's
Mm-hmm.
even some authors now that actually do audio first, where they'll put their audiobook out first before the print or ebook version is even released.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's a hugely important thing, especially since the pandemic. It's
Mm-hmm.
seen a huge
Mm-hmm.
uptick because people were home not doing anything, and they're like, hey, audiobooks. Especially now, I think people are starting to realize too that libraries carry audiobooks, and I'm not talking
Mm-hmm.
about going physically to a library and then checking it out like the CDs and the cassettes and things like that, but no, like an app. You can literally, I have right now I think like 4 audiobooks on my app called Libby. Also you can use Overdrive. There's a few out there, but
Overdrive. Yes.
mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said before, I'm listening to 48 hours or 48 laws of power.
Mm-hmm.
I have the new what was the autobiography, I'm glad my mom died. Like I have all of these literally on my phone right now through the Los Angeles Public Library.
Yes. Uh-huh. And I must say that I tend, even though I'm a fiction writer, I tend to listen to nonfiction the most on audiobooks. But let me find a series that I like, and there's no problem for me getting both the physical and the audiobook versions of them.
I feel
Uh,
like I'm very similar because with nonfiction, always I think I'll always do audio and it's easy to follow on audio.
yes. Uh-huh.
But with a fantasy work or sci-fi, like I have to at least read the first book or at least the first half of a book just to like figure out like, okay, what's this person's name? Like how's all before I can listen to it in audio.
But and you mentioned a very interesting thing because working with you, it occurred to me because I have the fourth book in my YA series that's coming out. Fingers crossed soon. It's off to the final editor. And it occurred to me, man, I would actually almost rather produce the audio book first.
Yeah. And that, even for me, even in my production like schedule, my audiobook production kind of serves as like my last proofread, because even sometimes when you hear someone read it out loud, you're like, "Ooh, wait, that's not actually how I will want it to be, or that's not what I was after." So I end up like changing something, because I work directly with a narrator in the booth, so sometimes I'll be rewriting the story like as they're going through.
Mm-hmm. And I must confess, that was one of the things I was thinking about. It's another one of those checks. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because with traditional publishing, before they went through all the consolidations and fired a whole bunch of editors who are now out offering editing services.
Yep, and that's one of my my editor for the majority of my books.
Mm-hmm.
She was once a traditional publishing editor,
Mm-hmm.
and now she's doing it on her own, and she's making bank because she's doing it on her own terms, and in her own schedule.
Yeah. And like I said, even before they had that shakedown and the getting rid of all these people, you typically had, I think, upwards of maybe 5 different people who were default, proofreaders, the typesetter, all of that, all of those things. So it's like, now that you're indie, you have all these people, but like you just said, even sitting down and getting your audio done and deciding which one you're going to put out first, that's just another line. And you're absolutely right. Hearing things, and because I just worked with you on one, you hear something and there's an itch to change it.
Especially when it's like older work too. You're like, oh.
But one of the things I have found, again, talking about technology, is one of the things I will do is, because Siri has come a very long way. Now, you deal with real audio people, so it probably drive you absolutely nuts. But sometimes just listening to something on a decent Siri voice that has the inflections and stuff, you find the same thing. It's like, because if it sounds smooth with Siri reading it, it's probably going to be really smooth with a human being reading it.
Yeah, and I actually use that a lot for proofreading. I use AI proofers for just listening through, or some authors will tell you, hey, when you're in your second draft, third draft, or you're finalizing, read it out loud, because you're going to hear things and capture things that you don't realize that you need to adjust. And that is very true, and you can do that now with a lot of these AI natural readers and things like that, where I actually was just using it yesterday because I was proofing another author's, I was beta reading for them, and I was using it, and it even has like mouth sounds and breathing to make it sound more like it's a real person.
Yes, it does. Yeah. I find myself doing that too. I will do that simply because I'm an editor and stuff like that. So it's easy for me to just have it. And I'm going through, basically, it's almost as if I'm using the Microsoft reader thing that some authors use.
Yeah, there's that too. Yeah.
And I'm going paragraph by paragraph. So I'm catching a lot of stuff and I'm listening to it. I said, that don't sound right. And I'm going back and I'm changing it at that point. Because of the way it sounds, and sometimes I'll just record it. I'll put it. I'll make it as a book, based audio book. Put it on my phone, and when I go walking in the morning, I'll listen to it and make mental notes and stuff. Like, okay, that worked. Okay, cool. There's all kind of different things to use, and so that's why when I bring particularly authors and stuff on here, I always like to find out what they're using. So it's really cool because it's something that anybody can do. I mean, if you have a computer, you have access to so many different tools that are on there to help you in your writing process before you ever get down to paying somebody else.
Right.
You have your manuscript done. What's the order of editors? Where does a beta reader come in as opposed to content or a proofreader? How does that typically work for you?
So for me, the way that I do it, first I start off with what I call an alpha reader, which is just someone who usually it's going to be like an author friend or something like that, who clearly knows, oh yeah, this is not a finished thing. Because sometimes if you have beta readers come in too soon, they'll give you notes that are like, no, that's not that. It's a first draft. It's a, like, so I have alpha first, and then I usually will have that then go to a content editor. And a content editor, also known as a developmental editor sometimes, are basically story editors. They come in and read it just based on story, no grammar, no line edits or anything like that. Then after that point, I will send it to beta readers, which are basically just sending it out to the general public. Most times, or sometimes, I find you'll have a lot of valuable feedback within the beta reader process, because that's where you're actually hearing from actual readers and how they're going to react to your story. Whereas like an editor, because I feel like sometimes if you're just doing the editors, you're going to get a very specific kind of feedback that's coming from like a professional. And sometimes you might get hung up on some stuff that a professional editor will say that a reader doesn't really care about. So you have to like figure that. You'll start figuring that with experience too, like the difference between reader feedback and like a professional feedback, and what matters. Because sometimes you'll have an editor who gets hung up on like this rule or that, but you're like, readers aren't really going to care about that rule or whatever. It's not affecting the story or the storytelling of whatever it might be. That's always going to be a case-by-case basis. Then after that, so then it goes to beta readers, and then it goes to a line editor or copy editor. Sometimes people separate that. Sometimes people say like line is more for like grammar and copy is more for like the flow of the language. It mixes and matches. So that'll be the last one, and then you will have the proofreader. And then for me, there's the additional step of having the audiobook, which is really like a final proofread. And then I would actually submit it to the retailers via print, audio, ebook, whatever it might be.
You pretty much have me convinced to go ahead and go with the audio as that last step before you put anything out. Because like I said, I already like audiobooks, but I actually like that, because you're right. Once you hear it spoken and read and you get the feel for it, it's like, okay.
Even something as simple as like dialogue tags. Like sometimes you're like, oh wait, I didn't need a dialogue tag there, because I definitely know who that person is,
Yes. And it's funny because I've done some editing on stuff that I've had other people read. And you're right. Although I think sometimes when we read it, the dialogue tags, it's almost like a period. We kind of skim over it, but when you're listening to it, you can really tell when it interrupts the flow of what's going on. And I found myself, like you said, I found myself taking some of those things out because they're not needed. And the question is, if I did the audiobook early, would I take those out of the manuscript before it went out, or would I leave them in? That's an interesting question. Your TJ Young series was optioned for adaptation?
Correct. Option just means that you gave a producer the rights to adapt your work. Authors do get paid out for that. Sometimes authors make careers literally just off of that, just on having their stuff optioned all the time. That's what George R. R. Martin, that's how he paid off a lot of his debts in the 80s and stuff like that, before he went and wrote A Song of Ice and Fire. That just a lot of his short stories and novels were just optioned all the time, not produced into anything. He didn't have anything produced until Game of Thrones came out on HBO. But that option, you still get money, because you're saying, here isn't the amount of money that says you're allowed to, for this time, a year, 18 months, whatever the terms are, to basically pitch this around or attach people to the project and that sort of thing. So right now, currently, TJ is in that period where it is optioned for adaptation. A writer was hired, writing it right now or soon. I'm not sure. Again, I don't know when this comes out, but probably when this comes out, writing it right now, which I'm really excited for. I kind of want to see how, a writer will adapt it for the big screen and stuff like that. And then at that point, the producer, writer, and then if you can, and at that time, attach any actors, you would take that and present that to the studios. And from that point, it's up to the studio to say yay or nay. And then the process recycles just like that.
Okay. And so, okay. And I was going to ask, but you do say a motion picture.
I personally would prefer it as a television series because I just like television, but right now the producer is trying to, he's working it as a motion picture movie.
With all the things that you have in your catalog, what are you working on next? I know you mentioned the third book of the series.
Mhm.
What else do you have coming up for yourself?
So it'd be TJ Young and the Orishas book 3, The Hero's Equinox. I am also working on an in-between novelette, which takes place between book 2 and 3, called An Axe for a Hammer, which depicts both Shango and Thor. A lot of people are familiar with Thor, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
as the Norse god of lightning. Less people familiar with Shango, who is the Yoruba Ifa faith system lightning deity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a cool little story with those two. And I'm also working on something called Tales from the Other Worlds, which is an anthology that I'm working with several other authors, which is due out in February. Oh, and that's the thing too, I always publish during like black focused dates. So February is usually when you'll see a release from me. Juneteenth, you'll always see a release from me on Juneteenth. And now October for Black Speculative Fiction Month. You'll always see those 3 months are always when you'll see something from me.
Nice, nice, nice. Really quick question. You do mention the African folklore mythology. Has that always been an interest for you, or is that something that happened, developed later in life as you became conscious of it? Why did you choose to focus on African folklore mythology?
I would say it was somewhat recent in that, and I think in 2015 I was watching the ending of one of the seasons of Game of Thrones, and literally I didn't even expect to like write myself. I mean, I was already writing creative or whatever, but I didn't really think, oh, I'm gonna write a book. It was more of, oh, I was looking for a book that did not exist, and I was like, oh, is there like an African Game of Thrones? And then I looked it up, and that's how I found, a lot of great authors. Like I found Nnedi Okorafor and
Mm-hmm.
like Cottawitch and a Lagoon and a bunch of other ones that she did, and N.K. Jemisin's the 5th season, which I liked, but none of them were exactly the book
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for. So then, I mean, apparently this is very common among writers, but I just did the thing that most writers do, and that's, oh, I wrote the book that I wanted to read, and that's how I started doing it. I just
Mm-hmm.
literally was like, I want to read this book specifically. Oh, it doesn't exist. Okay, I guess I'll write it.
Yeah, and that's you're right. That's a common inspiration. I also think for creatives, that's our solutions to so many things. When you look at our long history in this country, we've that's always been our route. We didn't see comic books that reflected us. We went and made comic books. I mean, I forget what the guy's name is. I have to find this, but he has this incredible history of Black comic book creators that goes all the way back to like the 1920s or 30s.
Oh shoot.
And every 20 or so years, it's like we shake ourselves up and we start doing it again. So,
Right.
so I think we've always have been like that, particularly when you don't see certain aspects or certain things portrayed. You go and you create your authentic characters, you create your stories. I mean, I'm doing the same thing. So, yeah, since the even before the pandemic, but certainly since the pandemic, a lot of people are trying something different. They're indulging in the dreams they've always had.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a now or never type thing. And I think there's a younger generation that's opted out, you know, of trying to work for a company for 30 years for a pension.
Yes.
Um, so what advice would you give to these writers who have ideas? They might have even started on a book and might have stopped or whatever. What advice would you give to writers or potential writers, people who are thinking about it, who are dusting something off, so to speak? What advice would you give to them?
Put yourself around people
Mhm.
that you want to be like. So it's really, really important, like your social circle, your work circle. Um, it's very true. I forget who said it. There was some famous philosopher. Somebody says you're basically the average of the 150 people you know in your life or something like that, right? So it's really important that those 150 people you put in your life are people who you want to be, or goals that you want to seek out. So, like, for example, a writer, right?
Mhm.
Put yourself in a writing community. Get yourself some writer friends. Get some accountability partners. Get some editor friends that you know. Swap stories with each other. Motivate each other. Say like, hey, what's going on? I hear you was doing a book, but I haven't heard anything in like 2 months. What's up? You need those people in your life. Um, if you want to succeed, and that's with anything in life, like even if you don't be, if you want to be like a carpenter or whatever, you need like carpenter friends. If you want to get into business overseas, then you got to have friends who are doing that, people who are into stocks and stuff like that.
Mhm.
You just have to make sure that your friend group, your work group, are all going in the same direction that you are going.
Thank you, because that is a very important thing. Because when you are around those people, like you say, even if it's an unspoken accountability, it's just the fact that the vibe, you know, being around those people, seeing what they're doing and being inspired and seeing that it's doable, you know. Well, thank you, Antoine, for being on my podcast. I really enjoyed this. And hopefully we can have you back. Particularly, I would definitely like to talk to you if you get the next good piece of news about your adaptation.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm hopefully I won't make it so that no one knows about it. Like the second I get the green light, because when I knew that this particular writer is writing the adaptation, I was like, am I allowed to say this? He's like, no, you have to hold off. And I was like, okay. The second he says I'm allowed, people are going to be annoyed with how much I'm going to be mentioning it. So don't worry. You guys will know.
Oh, good, cool. Well, thank you once again for coming on the podcast. Thank you for listening to another edition of the Urban Guru podcast. And of course, you can always find us on iTunes. Just search for Urban Guru and you'll find our podcast listed. You can also listen to this podcast on SoundCloud. Just search for Urban Guru Podcast and you'll be able to find it there too. Thank you again for listening. And remember, no matter whatever your creative endeavor is, always push forward, because every step that you take along that path will lead you to your ultimate destination. So I'll see you next time.